What we look at is the net present value of education in 5 countries, in Italy, France, Slovenia, Hungary and Poland. And we do that in a very original way for 2 reasons. One is that we distinguish by field of study. So we compute different net present value for social science rather than medicine, for example. And then we also put into the calculation the cost of education. And how do we do that in practically? Basically, we take the earnings 5 years after graduation of this group of students that were surveyed in the dataset. And then to that, we subtract the cost of education, where the cost of education means, for example, the fees, but this is not actually the most important part, especially in the countries we consider. The most important part is the opportunity cost of education. So what these graduates would have earned if they started working right after school rather than going to university. Why do we look at this? The first reason is that you observe in business surveys that employers constantly complain about the lack of graduates from STEM subjects like mathematics, engineering and technology. We were quite convinced that the only reason could not simply be that people don't like to study math because it's too difficult. And especially women, because even though education is expanding, still very few women enroll into engineering, for example. The other reason is that university education is becoming more and more universal, especially in the last cohort. And we started wondering whether there is a sort of differentiation between field of study. So whether it makes sense to speak about returns from university education in general, while so many people enter into education nowadays. Our results are quite interesting. First, we look at the distinction between cost and benefits. So for each of these 4 main fields we consider, we put together the cost side and the benefit side, so before and after graduation, more or less. And what we observe is that you can find in all countries a sort of categories. So there is, for example, the social science and humanities categories, where the cost of education is quite low, but the returns are quite high. And this explains why so many people enter into economics or social science. Then if we look at the STEM graduates, you understand why so few people want to study those subjects. And the reason is that the cost of education, especially the opportunity cost, is very, very high. So people that enroll into engineering or mathematics are either wealthy, so they don't need to care too much about the cost side, or they are very, very smart. They know they are very, very smart, and they can do this in relatively short time. Another case is the one of social science. Is the case of art and humanities, where the returns after graduation are very low, but also the costs are very low. So it's also sort of strategy for a student to choose that. And then there is medicines and related fields, where depending on the countries, the cost can be either high or low, but the returns are in any case quite good. So if we look at, if we try to make some conclusions out of these scatter plots that we have in the paper, what is interesting to observe is that, first of all, there is a clear STEM case, especially in France and Italy, where it's clearly not a good investment decision to enroll into these faculties, and especially for women, which constantly have lower returns, especially even more in these subjects. The second main conclusion from these numbers is that the cost side it's very important, and this is why our research is quite innovative, because normally when you calculate the returns from education, you only consider the earnings, whereas if you look at the cost, you understand how important these are. And the costs enter in different ways. As I said, one is the fee, but in Europe in general, with the exception of the UK, the fees are quite low. But the cost in terms of, for example, hours spent in education are quite differentiated by field of study. So, for example, you have the average the average time spent on books and classes. It's 29 hours per week in art and humanities, and it's 36 hours for STEM faculties. So if you think of a working week, you basically work or actually study one more day if you go into engineering, which is a lot, and perhaps doesn't allow you to have a part-time job on the side. The other lesson is that it is definitely worth studying social science, at least still now, and this explains why these faculties are so popular. Well, there are quite a few lessons for policymakers from this research. The first one is that what to study, the faculty you choose matters because you clearly have different net present values whether you enroll into engineering compared to arts. And this replicates a bit what happened with secondary education, where as education became more and more universal, let's say this inequality was thrown out of the door but came back from the window. And the way it did was that, for example, it was much more prestigious to enroll into general education compared to vocational training. So it seems that we observe this type of dynamic also with university education as it becomes more and more universal. The other main lesson is that, well, we don't know if the choosing a faculty rather than another, it's a perfectly rational decision, but the numbers seem to suggest that it's consistent with a rational choice. And this means that if it's really true that we need more graduates from STEM faculties, policymakers can play with incentives to encourage people to enroll, especially women.